Hello and welcome to this roundtable on public toilet equity. This is the second roundtable in a series that we've established at Pedestrian Space for the Global Walkability Correspondents Network on this topic of toilet equity. I'm co-hosting today with Karen in Perth. So welcome, Karen. Welcome everybody here. And I want to reflect a little bit on the establishment of this series. If you're watching, if you're listening and wondering what this is all about, this is really to get basic about, are you free to pee in your city? Where are public toilets in your city? How is the situation with access to clean, safe toilets in your city? When you leave, when you move around your city, what is the situation for you when you have to go, basically? So for me, coming from a personal experience, when I reflect on this issue, I realized in processing the topic of public toilets that I have myself accumulated a lot of trauma, in fact, with living in many really wonderful cities across the world, albeit cities that have really disastrous situations with access to public toilets. And after I established Pedestrian Space and started getting into this, as I will quote my co-host here, becoming kind of a toilet nerd, and posting on public toilet issues, sort of routinely hearing from people all across the world, posting, commenting, oh yeah, it's terrible in my city, I don't go to the bathroom, I hold it, I wait till I go home, there's no public toilets in my city, I've given up on public toilets. It's truly a global issue. As we start to get into the research, a term that came up that I personally love, it's about civic sanitation awareness. So anybody connected with a municipality or who has influence with municipal employees and listening to this, to me, this is a key term, civic sanitation awareness. What kind of civic sanitation are we providing for inhabitants of our cities across the world? For me, this is, again, Sustainable Urbanism 101, proper access to public toilets. So the motivation for this series is to lay the groundwork for international dialogue on this topic, because the issues vary greatly by region. And we also acknowledge in establishing this series that there are many angles to this topic that cannot possibly be covered in one single roundtable. And we are opening up this series to welcome people. If you're listening and you are involved in some way with issues of public toilet access from a gender perspective, from a parental perspective, from a caregiver perspective, disability, access, universal access, any of the issues, any of the angles, we really welcome you to get in touch with us at info@pedestrianspace.org. Anywhere that we link this, we'll have a link to also the resource page at Pedestrian Space that has recently been laid out for this series. So we are really welcoming people to get in touch with us as we lay the groundwork and welcome dialogue from around the world, and for people to join us to talk about this issue. We have a lot of different regions represented already in this roundtable today, so I'm going to turn it over to Karen. I'm in Warsaw. Karen is in Perth. I also want to pay homage to that. It is 11:17 here in Warsaw, and it is bright and early for Karen. We are hosting this at this time, very strange hours for both of us, to accommodate different time zones. It's very important for us to get different regions also represented in these roundtables and to welcome different time zones. So moving forward, we will continue to do that. So thank you. And Karen, thanks for being a co-host. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Annika. That really sets things up. You're right. It's 6 a.m. where I am, which is one of my best times of the day, but not a time I normally talk to other people. So it's very interesting to be here with you. So I want to acknowledge where I am as well. It's customary here to say that whose country I'm on. I'm speaking from Whadjuk Noongar country, which is the First Nations people in the place I live. So it's a beautiful part of the world in the bottom left-hand corner of Australia in the southwest. It's a very biodiverse place, and we're in a season, we have about 6 seasons here, and the season we're just about to enter is called Birak. It's the first summer. So it's been rainy and now it's about to get really hot and we won't see any rain for months. And that's what Christmas will look like for us. So that's where I am. My interest in this topic sits within just interest in inclusion and equity in cities, particularly gendered experiences of cities. I'm interested in the right to the city and spatial justice, and also urban sociology, so how we all get along with each other, particularly in public space, and how that builds social connection and resilience and community in our cities. So that's me. I also want to acknowledge that, we're talking, I think, a lot about cities in the global north, and I'm aware that there are, water and sanitation issues at different scales, and that have different impacts in different places of the world, as Annika said, and that there are 2.3 billion people without basic sanitation in the world, as I understand it, and I don't think that the sustainable development goal around that will be achieved. So that's something to talk about, but fascinating how it actually impacts people in every part of the world, no matter how developed or sophisticated or cosmopolitan we think our cities are. So that's me. So we've all put our location on the Jamboard, and there's only 6 of us, which is a lovely size group for a conversation. So that's how it will be. Shall I just pose that first question, Annika? Shall we just go into the? Okay, cool. So we wanted to start, and so with this topic, there is also a Jamboard in parallel, which you can update or add to at your leisure. So it's the third. I'll just have a look myself. It's the third slide along in that Jamboard, which poses the question, what's right in your city? And I think we're not all living in cities. Who's in New Jersey? Is it you, Tim? So do you live in a town, do you, rather than a city? Can you?
Yeah, I live in a small town.
Okay, well, I'll try and say town or city instead of city when I call on you.
What?
I
work up in New York, so.
Okay, so maybe we'll start with you. So the question we're asking is what's right in your city, just as a way of beginning our conversation. And it would be cool if you could speak at kind of more than one scale. So it'd be nice to hear from everyone, maybe a general statement about what's right and then an example, or the other way around. You can tell us a little toilet story or an anecdote or something you've observed, and then maybe you could frame that in terms of what it means more broadly for people in your place. Would you like to start us off, Tim?
Sure. Tim Cunningham. I'm a resident of Avon by the Sea, New Jersey, which, believe it or not, is by the sea. And I moved here 7 years ago from Belfast. So, and I'm currently working part-time at the Pratt Institute in New York City. So suppose I could give you a general overview of my experiences in those. Where I am at the minute, public bathroom facilities here is pretty good in the summer because it's a beach town. So in the summer, everything happens on the boardwalk. So there are 2 public bathrooms that are pretty well maintained with pretty good opening hours. The problem is they close at, one of them closes in early October and the other one closes in at Thanksgiving. So if you want to pee any time between Thanksgiving and Memorial Weekend, you're out of luck. And that's a long time to try and hold your bladder. So if you're down, my kids are 9 and 12, so if you happen to have your kids down on the boardwalk anytime between that period of Thanksgiving and the Memorial Day, guess what, you gotta run home or get home quickly or drive home or use the boardwalk underneath the boardwalk when there's nobody around if it's quiet, So that's a general observation. But I would say as far as the provision goes, it's good in the summer in that there are showers on the board, there's showers on the beach. There's a whole infrastructure set up to cater for the summer tourism. But as I say, there's an assumption that once that's gone, I understand there's some kind of argument that the pipes might freeze in the winter. But I understand there are public bathrooms available elsewhere in the world in the winter time. So I'm not entirely convinced by that excuse, but there you go. New York City, I spent a fair bit of time up there, walking about, going to say I'm working part-time up there and just sort of in and out of the city. I suppose for me, my interest in this is partly an issue around access to public space and equity and this increasing privatization of public space and privatization of facilities. In New York City, I find it can be very difficult at times to find a bathroom without paying for it, or without finding somewhere to pay for it. Particularly, again, I suppose it was an issue for me all my life, but having kids, it's really brings to the fore just how important these kind of facilities are. One little tip I might maybe share with you is I've discovered in New York City actually, clean and free bathrooms. Places of worship are really good places to find them. Some of by accident. Churches, synagogues, those type of places, they're generally free to get into. And if they've got other facility, they usually do have bathrooms. They're usually really well maintained. They're usually spotless, in fact, and actually very, very comfortable surroundings. So, but I've discovered that inadvertently while I would be out wandering around. I really enjoy walking, so I would have spent a lot of time just wandering around the city. And that was my general experience. Belfast, again, provision pretty poor. If anything, it seems to have gotten worse in the last 10 to 15 years, at least my time in the city. Public bathrooms are generally, I suppose it's like a lot of other things where I would say my experience is that investment in the free public service has been gradually whittled down. And it forces people like me to go into Starbucks or wherever, or somewhere that I don't really want a coffee or a bottle of water, but I buy one so that I can use the bathroom. And if you have $1 or $2 to spare, you do it. But I'm always cognizant of the fact that not everybody has the wherewithal to spend $1 or $2. And if you've got kids and young kids, you're going to be using them more often. So I suppose that would be my general overview on this. And I haven't done any research in this area beyond my public. I've read a few articles by Clara Greed, which I found actually to be very informative and very interesting. I'm teaching a course called Shaping the Contemporary City, and I have a group of students at the minute who are doing a project on public toilets. It's not my area, but I have them doing that, and some of their findings have been quite interesting. I'm looking forward to their final report, which is due in early December. So that's probably enough thoughts from me.
That's a great overview, Tim, and I really liked how you took us to two different continents there, and also a couple of nuances about the places of worship is a great tip, and that thing about buying stuff, of course, that's part of the conversation. I think we probably all get that if we're interested, but the fact that you said that some people use the bathroom more often, so then that becomes even more of a penalty. That's just, a little extra thing that I hadn't thought of before.
Yeah. So there's one other point I'd like to make. Public bathroom provision on transportation is absolutely woeful. That's probably, when I go up to the city, I don't like driving. So for a variety of reasons, I take the train, New Jersey Transit. So the train journey is 2 hours, and the bathrooms are typically, there's one at the back of the train, maybe you'll get two. The problem isn't the weight, the problem is usually the condition and the state of them. And the general, demeanor. I don't know how regularly they're serviced. It's not very often. And I'm talking getting on a train at maybe like 8 o'clock in the morning. That's obviously like still a commuter train. It's busy. There's a lot of people arriving. And if you're waiting 2 hours, if you're going to be sitting on it 2 hours, it's a train on it's bathrooms on public transport, and obviously in the train stations, Penn Station and all that, absolutely shocking. Really, again, run down. So if you really need to use the bathroom, you go in Penn Station. If you can wait until you get to where you're going, you wait to get to where you're going. And again, you just look at it as clearly lack of investment. People aren't being paid to upkeep, the state of the place is pretty bad. So that's something else that I've encountered recently. And again, I would see that in the general. If we're trying to get people to use public transport and move toward more sustainable modes of transport, well, actually, I've never taken my kids on the train. In fact, I took my son once when he was like 5, and it was a total nightmare. So that's my other observation on this. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and you're talking about condition and upkeep there, and that is relevant to lots of different types. Well, it could be potentially unpleasant for all of us, but you're right. Kids and different people have different reactions to that. And I personally have a child who has very high standards for where she wants to go to the toilet. So if it's foul, that might mean that she won't go, and then obviously that that doesn't work out usually. So different people have different responses to that sort of discomfort. And also, I'm reading in Leslie Lowe's book about the numbers, which kind of goes to what you're saying, Tim, about our willingness to invest in public provision in the commons, and that getting worse. So in New York, according to this book, which is published a couple of years ago, in the 1940s, New York maintained 1,500 toilets in subway stations, and now there's 75, which is an astonishing contraction of providing for basic needs, and we haven't stopped going to the toilet. So it seems pretty weird. So someone else, Darren, would you like to tell us what's right, and you can also go into what's wrong? Tim gave us an overview from both positive and negative, so that worked well. If you want to do that.
Yeah, I think for me, understanding access to public restrooms has always been a top priority. I have always, when I have to go, I have to go. I don't have time to wait. And quite honestly, until I got some things figured out, it really limited how much I was willing to explore in a city, or where I was willing to go, because I was afraid I'd get someplace and not being able to use the restroom. So in Madison, access to public, there are no public restrooms per se without being inside of private spaces or some, semi-public spaces. The State House, there's restrooms there that you can access, but when it's open, it closes, at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. There's a Madison Museum of Contemporary Art where there's public restrooms there. But otherwise, being in and around downtown, I was always excited that I've always had an office with a key card into buildings, because that provides me a restroom no matter when I'm downtown, even in off hours, and I'll just key myself into the building and go use a restroom. But then, outside of that, you're left to, as I've experienced and Tim's talked about, Starbucks or coffee shops, but then I found not even all coffee shops seem to have open restrooms. But I always know that Starbucks does, but I do have to buy something, which then usually is something that leads me to have to go to the bathroom not that far down the road. So it's a vicious cycle when I'm going through that.
Yeah, I get that. Thank you. And I was reading last night about this distinction between public toilets and publicly accessible toilets, which is
Yes.
obvious, and it does go to that privatization thing. Yeah, and I what you're saying makes me think about like the having to buy stuff in those private spaces is it's self-enforced and or enforced by that commercial entity or business. So they might have signage that discourages you. They might have that sort of gatekeeping of having to get a key. Just kind of, when we talk about dignity, it's a bit weird, right? Or you might be queuing to get the key or all of that. But also it's about who we are, like our privilege, like whether we're acceptable to come into a place and we're going to be accommodated is a thing that other people talk about. But also I think just how guilty or bold we are, like, will you sneak in? Will you go into a place and try and use the toilet without buying something, or do you just accept and internalize that that's a fee that you have to pay? So there's a lot that sort of swirls around that.
In my personal experience, I've learned that most hotel lobbies have restrooms, but you never want to ask, because then that checks a box that you're not staying there. So you just walk confidently through the lobby, and you'll find the bathroom eventually.
Can I please raise
agree.
I'm raising my hand, please? Darren,
Yes,
I'm so glad somebody else brought this up, because I was just putting a note in the Jamboard, so I want to plug the Jamboard again. Props to Karen for setting up the Jamboard. Everybody, please go there, add stuff. This is a really great way for us to gather insight content from every single roundtable for data as well. So please go in and drop your thoughts there. There's seven boards you just click through. So I was just now, as I was listening to you guys talk, I was adding my thoughts to the negative associations with public bathrooms. And I was saying, I've lived in many so-called sophisticated, developed cities where I'd be like scavenging through a hotel lobby to find a bathroom, like, oh, can I make it without, like, I don't stay here, but maybe, just hoping, or just begging, a restaurant, please, can you let me use a bathroom? And as some people have noted here, Tim, you mentioned traveling with a child. It changes when you have a child. You just don't have the time anymore, the patient, the time limit, your kids got to go, you got to go. But Darren, I just have to say, I appreciate you bringing up the hotel lobby unabashedly, because I can't tell you how many times as a young woman I've just waltzed through hotel lobbies to find the bathroom, because there simply weren't any bathrooms in the city to use at all, period.
Yeah, and I love the confident walk. I also do that walk, head held high. I belong here.
But like
Um,
now with my kids, I'd have to schlep a stroller and like, and we'd be cause much more of a spectacle and maybe
yes,
cause more questions. So it
you're
might
more
not,
obtrusive.
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, that kind of starts me thinking a lot, something I've been thinking about the amount of mental maps. I mean, I guess hotels would have implications for tourists. If you know, one thing we can all talk about is whether you're familiar or unfamiliar with a city. But yeah, that mental map thing, so much data we're carrying around in our heads within cities, and mapping and how we communicate what's available and is another interest of mine, which maybe we'll have time to talk about later. Okay, so oh, and with the Jamboard, Dylan, I'll come to you just in one sec. I agree, Annika, it would be great to have your everyone's content in the Jamboard, but I understand if you want to be in the conversation now, we can have some time at the end if you want to add to that, because some people, not everyone likes to do the things in parallel. Okay, Dylan, tell us something.
Yeah, so excuse me. Yeah, there's not a lot of positive to say about Toronto, but I'll just give a sketch of what we do have. I mean, it's a big city. We have 2.7 million people or so. The public washrooms that we do have, we have parks, public washrooms. Almost all of those closed for the winter. A very small number stay open, usually where there's a skating rink, for example. We do have public washrooms in community centers and libraries to some extent, which are open during those opening hours. There was going to be a set of those automated public washrooms that you find in Europe. And they put like 1 or 2 up, and then they just gave up on that idea. So there's like 2 of those somewhere in the city. I can't remember exactly where. I think kind of in the waterfront where there's a lot of tourists. The positive thing in Toronto is that there's a lot of people who are really pissed off at the really terrible washroom infrastructure. I think Leslie Lowe actually lives in Toronto at the moment. And it was actually a bit of a issue during the recent municipal election. A lot of people got worked up about it. There's been a lot of attention to the fact that we're even building new park washrooms and we're not winterizing them, which seems absurd, right? Like we could easily make the new ones winterized, and yet there's a new public washroom just got opened and in the park, and it's not winterized. Also, the park washrooms are closed at night, often fairly early. Especially during COVID, people started walking in the park late in the evening and discovering that the washrooms were locked, even though they're supposed to be open during the summer. So there's been a lot of discussion about that, and some city councillors have tried to get movement on that. So I would say that's the positive thing about Toronto is that awareness and movement that we need to be better. I want to say a couple of things about travel as well. So this is for Annika. My wife and I were in Warsaw on a stopover a few years ago. We had like 9 hours stopover, and we thought, well, we'll just go into Warsaw. And of course, it was great because, I mean, nowadays you can use cards to pay for everything, so we didn't even need to convert any money, except for the fact that we wanted to use a public washroom and you needed like a small coin, and we just did not have that small coin. And that really brought us up short on the effect of having a paid public washroom, and that although we were able to wander over Warsaw and pay for a restaurant, eventually went to a restaurant and paid for lunch and used the washroom there. But although we could do that, and we could take the taxi, and we could take the train, and we could buy souvenirs all with a card, the one thing we couldn't do with a card was actually just go to the washroom. And so that was very present. And then recently, just a few weeks ago, I was in Berlin, and I posted this on the page 7 of the board. And there was a public washroom at a major intersection. And I went to use it, and it was great. It was really clean. It was fun. Like there was this cute picture of a kind of, peeing boy in the urinal. But it was really interesting because the urinals were free. But the stalls cost money. And of course, for the women, that meant that there was no free option. And I posted it on Twitter, and someone was like, well, that's pretty biased, and it is. And I thought that was an interesting thing, that the urinals were free, but the stalls were paid, and that meant that men had a free option, at least for some of their needs, and women did not. On the other hand, the washroom was extremely clean, which was great, and it was, you know, it was really nicely capped and everything. And definitely, I noticed in Germany, a lot of public washrooms were paid, but they were also often really well capped. So I thought that was interesting, and it brings up an interesting issue. I mean, I don't know why the urinals are free. I mean, maybe they're more worried about drunk men peeing, or the, you know, they took out the old pissoir and then they needed to replace them or something. I'm not sure what the story is about that, but it feels like an interesting issue. So those are my contributions.
That's an interesting point about the urinals being free, because I was looking through, and on page 1 of the Jamboard, there's a couple of them, or maybe it wasn't page 1. There's like the public urinals they have in like Amsterdam and stuff.
Yeah, the little circular ones.
Yeah. And I've heard you know, sometimes people complain like, oh, well, you know, that's unsanitary because there's nowhere to wash your hands. And you're like, okay, but it's a transient space and it's better than absolutely nothing. So I think, and I think that's the point of that's the only thing I can imagine why the urinals are free in Germany, is because you're gonna be moving a lot quicker. I don't know, but yeah, it's super interesting.
I think it may be because, I mean, I wondered if, I mean, those old like little circular things, obviously those are also gendered. But I have a feeling it may be because there's a lot more expectation that there will be more drunk men at night around.
Well,
and they don't want them pissing in alleyways. So whereas that's not so much of a danger for women. Like I was wondering if maybe it was something gendered like that in terms of gendered expectations of behavior. Yeah. I don't know. I thought, it's interesting.
It's fascinating, absolutely, and I love hearing you talk about that. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we're all guessing?
Yeah.
You know, that it's not clear. And yeah, we could probably do a whole session theorizing that. But yeah, obviously the gendered part of that. I mean, you know, and I must acknowledge as well that urinals don't suit all people who can pee standing up. It's not provision for everyone. And that kind of goes, that conversation and the idea of sitting or standing goes to, I haven't got her name in front of me, but there's a terrific podcast that piqued my interest in this. And I think Annika will probably put a link on, it's from a podcast called The City Unfinished. There's just 3 episodes. It's in Amsterdam. So one of the researchers who is speaking in that talks about sitting and standing, so our body techniques as a way of looking at this. You know, gender obviously still is an important lens, but that's an interesting way of looking at it. And that podcast covers some things like this. And in fact, at our other session, one of a colleague who I met in Amsterdam, where I was in summer, where I took some of these photos, mentioned that she was told that there was a problem with drunk men in Amsterdam falling in the canals when they were peeing. So that was one of the motivations for the installation of so many of those urinals. But yeah, when I think someone, either you, Peter, or Dylan, said it's better than nothing, and that's what women have, is literally nothing. You know, so if you have closure of public of cafes and stuff when things are closed, and this is discussed in the podcast, so I won't talk about that anymore. But so Peter, maybe you would like to talk now. Tell us a bit about where you are.
Sure, yeah. I'll even turn my camera on. Yeah, so I'm in Sonoma County, just north of San Francisco. And I think it's just an interesting topic, especially here in San Francisco. We there's a large homeless population, but I don't think that's unique to San Francisco. And one of the things that people are always like, oh yeah, they're going to the bathroom just on the streets. And I was like, yeah, well, they don't really have a lot of options. Like it's, as somebody who's like worked in retail and stuff before, like it's always the manager who's like, hey, you can't let them in here. I was like, well, where else are they going to go? Like the need doesn't go away just because you won't permit it. And I think that that's just a little subtle thing that kind of keeps homelessness criminalized. But I think it's also funny how when you go places where you travel and you're like, oh, hey, look, there's a bathroom here. Like, what a luxury. And you're like, no, like why don't we just have that? Like, it's so funny that we are all warriors for bike lanes, but maybe we should also just be warriors for basic human needs. And actually, I don't know if it's the same podcast because I don't remember which one you were talking about, but I listened to one time about a trans person's experience, just their daily life, trying to find somewhere to go to the bathroom, right? Like trying to find a gender neutral place or someplace where they're not going to get hassled. And it's just a whole different lens that I wasn't aware of. And now it's something I notice all the time. Because yeah, it's one thing to just write like gender neutral on the toilet, but is it really a safe place for them? Yeah, I just think it's a really interesting topic that we don't really talk enough about, Anyway.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And Leslie Lowe covers San Francisco, and the cost of cleaning up because people are forced to go in public is a whole other interesting thing.
I lived for a little bit in Seattle, and my wife was telling me this story. She went downtown and she was doing something, and there's a guy on the street, just like he was having an emergency, as happens sometimes, and he just was panicked because he couldn't go anywhere. So he's just sitting there on the street and everyone's like, oh, disgusting. And he is also feeling less of a human, because he's forced into the situation. And I don't know, it's heartbreaking that we just let that be.
Karen, if you don't mind, if I could just jump in here real quick. I was watching a YouTube some YouTube videos of city planning and stuff, and one video, really exciting video about Detroit, led me to one on San Francisco, where the guy, some sort of urban influencer guy, was pointing out this issue that had apparently become really intense in recent years about people going on the street in San Francisco because there's been a decrease in public toilet provision. There's been, because of COVID, there's been a clampdown of businesses offering any sort of public toilets, even if you're a customer. So it's become a real serious issue, coupled with homelessness. It's just become a very serious issue. So for me, as an American too, knowing what it's like to live in a city where what tent camps look like, and the fact that these people need sanitary spaces to go to the bathroom, and often if there's generally no public toilets for us to find, what are homeless people finding for public? Of course they're going in the streets, which of course we're encountering as city inhabitants. All of us are dealing with this together. So I think what's really interesting to me, as my co-host knows, is that we're all coming to this with various interests, and of course in this Walkability Correspondents network, generally a high level awareness, I think, of the multiple layers. But I think that's also a great thing to remember, is that of course this isn't always obvious, strangely to people, that there's a massive public health issue here. And then, as we know, there's an issue with gender inclusion that's very apparent, as you just pointed out, and that we look forward to getting into. And basic civic sanitation awareness. If I can't walk out in my city and walk a few kilometers or American mile and find a place to pee, what's going on? I really like what you said, Peter, that this is it's strange that we're not talking about this more. So that's really the whole point of this series. I see Dylan's raising his hand, and then I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Yeah, Dylan, please.
Yeah, so I wanted to share something. It's really interesting. So I did a magazine in Toronto called Spacing Magazine, which is about urban issues in Toronto. And we had a really interesting article a few years ago, which brought a really interesting perspective onto the issues of like homelessness and privilege and stuff like that. And that was someone writing about, and also from the point of view of like people having to use private facilities like, you know, coffee shops and whatever. And it was the point of view of the retail workers who have to clean washrooms that are being used as a last resort by people who may be drug addicts or homeless or whatever, and may not always, you know, be that, you know, may have problems being clean, who you know, may mess up, mess up the things, leave needles, leave, you know, not flush or whatever. And that this burden of cleaning was being dumped onto the lowest wage people, untrained people in the city, because we don't have public washroom facilities and we don't have facilities for people who are homeless or people who are addicted, living on the street or whatever. And it was a really interesting perspective on that whole issue, right? Like we think of, you know, how frustrating it is to have to, you know, buy something if we need to use a coffee shop to go to the washroom. Obviously, some people are just going to go use the washroom, and if they're homeless or whatever, maybe no one's going to stop them. But that does leave these untrained employees who are low wage to have to do extremely dirty work, extremely often traumatizing work. Sometimes they may find people who are actually passed out or need medical attention, locked in the bathroom, you know, to cope with these situations. And I thought that was a really interesting angle on it, because we often think of, you know, the issue of like, you know, where are homeless people going to use it, or we think of the, you know, the manager who won't let people use the washroom. But it was interesting to think of the point of view of these employees, low-wage employees, who are faced with having to deal with this social problem that is the result of us neither taking care of people who have mental and addictive problems and not providing public washrooms that are actually well provisioned. So I thought that was a really interesting issue, which I'd never thought of before I read this article, and it really like brought that aspect to my attention.
Yes, thank you. That's very interesting, and picks up a lot of things, as you said, about the broader problems. It's an interface with that. Darren.
Thanks. When Dylan was talking, I was thinking about some aspects from my early career. I used to be in event management, and we would do a big festival in Columbus, Ohio, the Oktoberfest. We'd have 250,000 people come over the course of a weekend and drink lots of beer. And you know, the thinking, and I was the operations manager, so in charge of, you know, building a city for 3 days, essentially all the infrastructure that went out there. But it was impressed upon me when I started, because the festival had been multiple years, even a couple decades strong when I got there. But we used to hire these restroom trailers that were gorgeous. They were nicer than many home trailers, and they had attendants for every one of them who would regularly keep up with it. And the philosophy behind that was, people aren't comfortable using the plastic porta potty like we have here in the US. So that would limit their beer drinking. And if they limit their beer drinking, then they leave their event. But if we provide them with a really nice, comfortable restroom, they'll stay longer and they'll spend more money. And, you know, that was, you know, just something that had always impressed upon me. And I just never drew the connection to general city building until right now when Dylan was talking. And then, you know, the other aspect in my career, my wife and I had a retail store in a small downtown, and I was also the downtown development director. And when we'd have special events, the business owners would scream all the time about people who would come in to use their restrooms. And, you know, of course, we provide, you know, the portable plastic units out at the event, but again, people are going to try to find a more, you know, a nicer space than the plastic one. And when we had our store, we had the idea of, we paid a neighbor cash under the table, and she would be stationed outside of our restroom, and would go in and give it a wipe down after, every person or every couple people, make sure the toilet paper was stocked. But our expectation was people wouldn't buy anything. We had a coupon. We put a sandwich board out in front that said, open restroom, to let people know they're willing to come. And then we had a coupon when they walked out. We handed them a coupon that had to be used within the next 2 weeks, from the day after the event, within 2 weeks, to invite them to come back. So they didn't come back, but we got a really good return rate of people coming back and using that coupon.
Can I jump in here? I just want to say this is fascinating. And Darren, I know you have Polish heritage, and we've talked about the Global Walkability Correspondents Network meeting in Poland, and maybe there's some connection with your activities managing toilets and and the Polish tradition also, because if you look at the link when I post this video of our first roundtable earlier this week, I included a link with a presentation to a little bit about my encounter with Polish toilets, with they have these toilet offices, but how you approach toilet office management for events is fascinating. And I'm actually really curious, what is this? This idea, what are gorgeous restaurant, what is this? Can you describe that more, please?
Yeah, I mean, they came in on trailers, 24-foot trailers, and you would walk up. They were heated and cooled. They had sound systems inside. They had tiled floors. They had granite counters for washing hands. They had hot and cold running water. And they had individual stalls with porcelain toilets. And I mean, it cost us a lot of money in that, to have those. And the joke is, when my wife and I got married, we got married on her parents' farm, and 130 people, and trying to use one house toilet for a septic system would not work. But a wedding gift to us from the toilet vendor was a trailer for our wedding. And our guests loved it. They took pictures inside of this thing.
That's
because
amazing.
They just thought it was the absolute best.
Okay,
the
we have
best thing.
some questions, but really quick, does it come with a person that maintains it? I mean, does it come with somebody like who's maintaining? Like, what is the hour? How is the hour distribution?
Yes, you could rent the trailers and not have a person. We always contracted to have an attendant with them.
Okay.
And the attendant would be one. I think we had, if I recall, so this was almost 20 years ago now. We had probably 10 or 15 trailers on site, and so we'd have 3 attendants that would just make the rounds and go around,
Okay.
and just do a check and clean it up and all that other stuff.
Well, I have to say, I've had a number of conversations with people now that we're hosting these talks, just sort of offline, and who I share about the series, and they always comment, "Oh, I don't like porta potties." Now, who does like porta potties? Nobody likes porta potties. This is just the most disgusting available solution ever, anywhere. As my son said, he saw a porta potty for the first time. He said, "That does not look like a good idea," and he turned away and held it. Karen, when you were talking earlier about your child, yeah, we went to a breakfast market this past summer, and my son, for the first time, came encounter with porta potties. It was at the breakfast market, and he literally said, "That does not look like a good idea. Exit stage." Done. And I agreed with him, and I actually wrote to the organizers, and they said, "We haven't had a problem," but to me that is a problem. You have a breakfast market, hundreds of people. It's an amazing breakfast market, but still hundreds of people. It just doesn't cut it. Porta potties as an option for us to go to the bathroom. But this option you mentioned, Darren, it sounds really great, and I love the idea that it seems like also a real hygienic option, and also the maintenance. So, Peter.
Yeah, I know I know those trailers you're talking about. I've encountered them at festivals every once in a while. Yeah. Normally by the end of like a 3-day festival, they're trashed, but having a an attendant, that's a great idea. No, but some of the things that like Dylan was saying, and I guess Darren too, was that got me thinking about the economics of it. So Annika mentioned like when we were talking about going out on the streets, like the cost of cleaning it up and all that kind of stuff. And then Dylan, you mentioned the cost associated. You mentioned labor associated with people cleaning up after when they use private bathrooms versus when they don't have a public option. And Darren, you're even talking about how you used it as a marketing opportunity. And I just think it's just there's such an economic component to it that I think is interesting, that through these stories, I'm like, wait a minute, there's a common thread here. Yeah, I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah, I agree. And it's relevant as one of the many layers and aspects of this, but it's also relevant because, you know, increasingly there needs to be an economic justification for everything. So it is the language that sometimes we need to speak, although I don't think it's the whole conversation. So yeah, acknowledging that. There were so many interesting things and links there, Darren, and to go to that, to jump off from what Peter was saying about economics, is that there is some discussion in Leslie's book about business improvement districts and them taking it upon themselves to facilitate or to pay for or to make commercial arrangements, which often include swapping advertising for provision or advertising rights for the automatic toilets and things like that. So yeah, obviously the acknowledgement is that if people stay longer, they'll spend more, which is one way of looking at people being in public. Obviously, some of us also want people to stay in public and not have to buy something, you know, from a community development and urban sort of vibrancy point of view. So, but both those things have validity and facilitate dignity, access, and people being together in a city or a town. But sometimes, obviously, there are layers of permission and privilege mixed up in there. And I love the festival stuff too, because I also come from a festival organising background. So we had, I think, on a big board, one of those big flashing light boards at a festival that I used to be involved in, easy to see, easy to pee, easy to hear, easy for beer, which probably distills Australians' priorities at a festival. But we did also once provide, like, we really oversupplied women's toilets one year, and we made this zone that, because we were observing the queuing and, you know, even using appropriate ratios and standards for what was required by law for temporary events, to, you know, which does include a little bit more stall provision for women, usually a different calculation, that there were still ridiculous queues and stuff. So we made this zone, and I think it was called the Pea Palace or something. And, you know, we did a bunch of other stuff, like put a bunch of toiletry products in there and, you know, made it kind of a funny thing as well, which I now realise, reading Leslie's book, it seemed like we went above and beyond, but actually probably we were only just producing equity because of wait times and how long it takes women to go and all of that sort of stuff. But one of the things that came up in what you were saying for me and thinking about that was about gratitude and like how everyone's like, this is amazing when you do something like that, and how odd that is, really, because like we should all be able to go, right? So yeah, the idea that people are like, this is so lovely, it's so amazing, it really kind of points to what's missing. So
wait, real quick, you said that you observed the standards. What are the so one of the things I do for work is special event permits, and usually we refer that out to the health department, and they just say, oh yeah, make sure it's ADA, make sure it's disability accessible. What are your standards? I'm just curious.
So for public events, there is a ratio so it's similar to, I think you probably have it in building approvals for, if you're building a theatre or whatever. I was thinking about the arts. So yeah, if you're doing a temporary event, there would be public event guidelines at a state level, I think, and then approvals would usually be a local government level. So you would have to put in an event application and get approved, and yeah, they would apply some standards. And I think the standards would change. Oh, so liquor licensing is also involved. So if you're serving booze, obviously, I think you might have an increased provision, probably for urinals. So yeah, you have to be compliant, to put the event, to be allowed to put an event on, you have to meet a ratio, and you would get that checked out, like it would be inspected before you could open doors, perhaps even. So you might have people queuing outside and there's someone walking around with a clipboard making sure you've got enough toilet. You don't have that? We love rules over here.
No, well, maybe we don't have we're not talking about events the same size, but no, that would be great.
Cool, but embedded in those standards may be a lot of provision for a particular person that we're thinking about, like the idea of toilets and bathrooms being based on US military personnel's bodies. There's a discussion about that, I think, in the book, about who we base our dimensions and the way we physically design space for. Yeah, so I was going to say, now I've got a couple of things I wanted to ask you further, but because I just said a lot of words, is there anything else you want to say now to kind of close out what we've just talked about together? Anyone, you could put a hand up. We just come off mute.
I would just add, when you talked about the standards, I think in the US for festivals, most of our portable restrooms tend to be gender neutral. So we don't, at least the ones I was familiar with, don't necessarily get into those calculations, but they do fit into building codes. And a story that I had was, my brother's an architect, and he was designing a country club outside of Columbus, Ohio. And the person who was putting it up was a gentleman by the name of Les Wexner, who owns brands in the US, Victoria's Secret and Bath and Body Works and stuff. And when he saw the plans, he said, I have a problem with the women's facilities in this country club. And they said, well, they're to code, the number of provisions that we have to have. He said, but I made all of my money off of women, triple it. I don't ever want a woman to feel like they're getting shortchanged in my facility. And so they did. They just made it, 3 times bigger than over the code there. So
that's, yeah. Isn't that interesting though, that it takes someone to be someone with wealth to make a grand gesture, and then you may have equity, like they've waved a magic wand. Oh, that's my response. Like, cool, you're a good guy, but why can't we actually just have that all the time? Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes left in our block of time. I proposed to you 2 different courses of action we could take for the remainder of our conversation. One is, I just wanted to, given that this is part of the global Walkability Correspondent networks and Pedestrian Spaces, sort of the host. A couple of us have mentioned walking. Tim, you mentioned walking. Peter, you mentioned bike lanes. I'm a active transport and equity around inclusion in active transport is a huge interest of mine. So, and it also goes to how we are out in cities and how long we can stay out and how we're allowed to move around our mobility choices. So one idea is for us to have a little chat about that. My other idea, and maybe we can do this in the last 5 minutes, if not now, is it would be interesting just to hear from you about what else you were hoping to cover. So like as a little poll for us to think about how we might construct future conversations, because this is clearly a very layered thing. So maybe we could wind up with that. Do you have a preference? Does anyone want to talk about active transport now?
I always want to talk about active transport.
Me too, me too. Well, why don't you kick us off then, Pete? Does anyone else object to us talking about active transport now? Okay, good. Let's framing it that way. We guarantee the conversation. So, Peter, do you want to start? I'd like to hear more. I wrote down your quote about we're all warriors for bike lanes. Why not basic human needs?
Yeah, it's funny to me because it seems so. It's weird. Just you just go biking around and you can find gas stations and parking lots and just all these provisions for cars. And well, what if I don't need to gas up my car, but I do need to pee? Like why it's another aspect of car centrality, I think, but that might be a bit of a stretch, I'm sure. But I was recently at I guess a roundtable thing from my town where people were talking about, oh, what do you want to see in your complete streets? Like what for road design, what do you want to see? And everybody was talking about, oh, we need more bike lanes and like wider sidewalks. And I was like, well, what about, a facility, a place where people can go to the bathroom? I think that's a big part of walkability, right? People always talk about walkable neighborhoods, especially in this neighborhood that we were talking about. Everyone was like, oh, it's very walkable. And I was like, yeah, if you want to walk around the block and come back to your house, but no one's going to come visit your neighborhood because they don't have anything. They don't have a bathroom. They can only stay for so long. So anyway, that's how I connected to active transit.
Yeah, great. Dylan?
I just wanted to pick up on something that Peter said. I was reading recently, I read something recently about history of public bathrooms in Toronto. It might have been for spacing or something, I can't remember. But they really linked the actual spread of gas stations that are required to have a public washroom to the reduction of public washrooms in the rest of the city, which is really interesting because I think it kind of links the expansion of driving and the reduction of walking to the expansion of washrooms for people driving in gas stations, paralleling the reduction of actual provision of public washrooms for people walking in the city. So I just wanted to pick up on that aspect.
Yes, entirely. I'll come to you in just one second, Tim. Yeah, and I literally read that last night in Leslie's book, and I was like, yeah, because she's been trying to sort of tracking that history of the reduction of facilities in public space, but then directly linked it to, so yeah, the replacement of facilities for pedestrians with facilities for drivers. Yeah, so that, yeah, we've talked about that, Leslie talking about car provision replacing. Yeah, I live in a very, very, very low density city with very, very dispersed land use. So yeah, it's just not an equivalent. There's no way you could walk between petrol stations in most parts of the city. We call it petrol stations. So that actually brings me, I'll just, while we perhaps wait for Tim's internet to catch up.
I took off my earphones.
Oh, you're good.
That helps.
Yeah, you're back. You're good. Well, then I'm going to write down what I was just going to talk about, which was maps. Okay. So you go.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say there's a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, the two sort of main resources, it seems, there's the book by Leslie and Clara Greaves' book. So it's interesting that it's predominantly, well, if we compare the amount of literature and material and discussion on this compared to any other issue, so there's two books that have been written on it, both by women, and I'm automatically thinking here of Caroline Perez's book Invisible Women, which I thought very, very well explained how the built environment is shaped by men for men. So whether it's toilet provision, the urinals over non-urinals, and everything else, it's back to this gendered aspect of the built environment. And I think as well. It's no coincidence why, of course, gas stations have it, because it's designed by men who drive cars and they want somewhere to pee when they're driving their car. But I also think it's interesting, Peter's point. I mean, I would read a lot of material also on walkability, complete streets, open streets, and traffic safety. So people are happy to talk about traffic safety, very happy to talk about the need for more trees and greenery, very happy to talk about asphalt art, public art, placemaking. Everybody's happy to talk about the nice stuff. And you mentioned bathroom, and there's a snigger, gasp, dirty, you know, don't mention bodily functions. So I don't know if there's this other kind of possibly a leftover of a male reluctance to talk about things that are seen to be, you know, bodily functions, or whether it's, and this is just a thought, whether it's perhaps maybe in a lot of the discussions around walkable spaces and creating walkable spaces in nice environments, again, the debate's being framed by people, I don't want to sound unfair here, but the debate is being framed by people who can afford to pay $5 to go to Starbucks and get a coffee. And, you know, so the walkable streets very, you know, debate is being shaped again by resources and gender. So it just seems to me this whole topic is gender inequality is screaming at me from every angle and every comment.
Thank you all, and we will start to say these sort of finishing up words, but I want to say stuff because I'm just so excited by that, by us coming around to gender at the end, and what you said, Tim. Firstly, want to say, and I think it's quite apt, love, you know, the way that you exited your input there, is that I really love it when a man sits down so a woman can stand up, which I think is pretty relevant to what we're talking about, and it's kind of a nice inversion of how we might use our bodies to on this topic. So yeah, that idea of gender and omission, and like just not talking about it, which is bigger than gender actually, and interesting to see that Toronto thing, because Leslie points out, like, she just does which I think is great, this kind of idea of like a textual analysis on all these city strategies, placemaking, even a seniors strategy she mentions in the book. You type Control F for the word toilet, washroom, bathroom, and there's just nothing, and it's bizarre. And that connects to some of the mapping stuff. I've got some maps up, which we won't have time to look at, but about Google Maps. There's also in Australia a continents map, which is designed to try and share information about toilet access, although it's quite incomplete. And then there's this open streets thing, which is like for mapping nerds. I have a login, and it has the most rich detail. Like, you get, like, there's bike shops, there's haircuts, there's like everything, and toilets are not on there. And it's just, so that omission. So if you really want to talk about being feminist allies and pushing the boundaries, I really recommend the podcast that we'll link it as well. So Justine Laurent is actually the academic speaking in it, and Anastasia I can't say her surname, Halauniova. So Justine Laurent, so there's a bit where she goes off on a tangent about like transgressive women's bodies, and it's pretty edgy stuff. So I really encourage you to check that out, and it's a good general survey of the topic. So yeah, and the placemaking, the Toronto strategy, one of the things that I wanted us to cover, and maybe we can cover it another time, is it would be nice to pull these sort of initiatives, maps, strategies. I think particularly around how we communicate this information, whether it's to tourists, locals, you know, Uber drivers, which is a whole other thing about mobile work. So interested in any initiatives or apps or projects in your cities, or that you've heard about elsewhere, because they seem quite fragmented. So that would be interesting to talk about, and of course any other books or research. So just in our last couple of minutes, also want to say, as Annika said, thank you for being here. And we would really, really like to continue this conversation and hope that you are interested in doing that too. So please keep in contact with us, and we will communicate with you about ongoing conversation and resources and sharing. Was there anything else that we didn't kind of flag or touch on that you were hoping to cover, or that you would like to see as a topic of conversation in the future? Darren, you've come off the mute. Yeah.
Yeah, not necessarily something different. I just really wanted to thank you both for getting this conversation going. It's one of those things where, I've internalized my issue and my challenge as a me problem, and thinking that, okay, it's just me that has to deal with this, and the rest of the world is normal and doesn't have to do this. And just this conversation has opened my eyes of, the broader problem of it, and just thinking about how people interact with space and all of that stuff. So I'm already kind of circling around with ideas to go back to Madison with, and see, what we can do to begin understanding where things are and then developing a path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that idea of problematizing bodies, or like kids' toilet, whether it's kids' toilet training or any other thing that we internalize, that we have to deal with it, or that we have to be excluded, which actually, kind of goes to a broader thing about individualism, I think. But let's not start on that right now. Anything else? Thank you for that, Darren. So, well, that tells me maybe we've, perhaps you'll think of things later, and please do hit us with them if you do. It tells me that we haven't done a bad job together of doing a bit of a survey and almost a bit of a topic map, which has been great. Thank you. We couldn't have done that on our own. So it's been very stimulating and interesting. So appreciate your presence here and your contributions.
I have a quick question before we end.
Sure.
Tim, I know that you had welcomed some of your students here. I know they're not here, but I wonder if you don't mind sharing a little bit about perhaps what your students are engaged in, or alternately what you're engaged in with the issue of public toilets and your work in your Shaping Contemporary Cities course.
Well, just the students are doing a project which are looking at toilet equity in New York City. So they've gone out and visited a number of sites, taken photographs, and they're in the middle of doing their field work at the moment. So they're going to be delivering a final. This is going to be their main project for the semester. I've got they're working on 4 different projects, my students. Placemaking public art is one, another one is stairwells, another one is public toilet access, and another one is garbage. So each of them is fairly open-ended, and I've given them just some ideas, some resources. So I'm certainly happy to share any of their findings with you later on whenever I get their project back, and I'll send on, if you don't mind, a video of this conversation.
Yeah, so just thinking there that students could tell us what they've learned as well. They might want to convert their findings. Anyone who's like a toilet nerd convert out of that research process, they might want to do a little presentation to our group, or we could convene an audience for them potentially. Okay, Darren, did you have something you wanted to say before we go?
No, at your toilet nerd comment.
Cool. Okay. Peter, Dylan, any final comments, and I guess we'll say goodbye.
I just want to say thank you for organizing this. It's been fascinating, and I've learned a lot. Thank you so much for taking the time and for the wild time zone range, which seems to have been like you're basically bracketing the North America, and we're all like taking part for North America, and you're bracketing it on either side.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure to hold space.
Thank you.
Yeah. space
Thank
and
you.
time, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool, great. Well, good to see you here, and really hope to see you again soon. I think Annika and I will stay on. Do you want to stay on for a few minutes and have a little chat?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
cool.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.